Hey guys, welcome back to Fix It Friday. So this week I have got a PS2 Slim here on my hands, and it is time to revisit the Retro Gem. So for those of you guys that are not aware, the Retro Gem is a HDMI modification that can be installed in several consoles, including the PS2 Fat, PS2 Slim, the Nintendo 64, the PS1, and very soon a few other consoles, including the Dreamcast, the Wii, and the Xbox. I have one of these myself. I love it. It does an excellent job of taking these consoles and allowing you to very easily connect them up to a modern display and make them look as good as they possibly can. So yeah, I've done an example installation of the Gem in pretty much all existing versions of the consoles and made videos on that. This is the last one I need to do. And I gotta say, I've always been quite fond of the PS2 Slim. It's got such a nice form factor. It's got a really awesome power supply. And it's impressive just how much they reduced things down with this console as they kept making different hardware revisions. So this one is one of the silver versions, and yeah, I also really like this instead of just the, kind of standard black that we all got used to in the United States. I mean, I know this is an American model too, but these are far less common. So yeah, let's go ahead and see what it takes to install one of these in a Slim, and yeah, let's have some fun. Okay, so let's go ahead and disassemble the console. This is very easy, in my opinion, compared to the PS2 Fat, because it has just a nicer design, in my opinion. So I start with like a little plastic spudger tool, or you can use your fingernail, and you just go ahead and remove 2 of the feet and 4 of these plastic covers. This is also where the warranty sticker is, and I just kind of carefully cut that out so that I can place it back, and it, basically looks original. All right, so now let's go ahead and just quickly remove these screws. Okay, so from here, there's a couple of different screws that we need to remove. So we've got these 3 that hold in the disk drive. Some consoles have 4, but this one is just ever so slightly different. Again, there's lots of different versions of the PS2 hardware. There's also one right here where the controller ports live. And there's 2 holding down this fan. Okay, so at this point now we're going to remove there's 3 flex cables. There's one for the spindle motor right here. There's this one here, which is for the laser, and this one here, which is for the worm screw that moves the laser up and down. I'm just using this curved tweezer just to carefully lift up the bales here. There we go. Now this will come out very easily. This one's just friction fit into place. And same for this one. I think I need a little more oomph. There we go. And with this model, there is an additional screw over here for the top RF shield. All right, so now we've got this thing taken apart. You can see that there are still 3 screws that hold everything together, so we're just gonna go ahead and remove those real quick. So now the bottom is free, and the top should also be free. Yep, there we go. Okay, everything is taken care of at this point. All right, so next thing we're going to do is a few modifications to the top of the PS2 shell, just to basically get the Retro Gem installed and in place. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is just get the Retro Gem itself ready for installation. And so the kit comes with like a little plastic cover, protective cover that goes on this side of the Gem. So I already went ahead and installed that off camera because there's really nothing complicated to that. Next thing we got to do is close a few jumpers on the Gem for indicating that we're working on a PS2 here. So for that, we got to close C, D, and E. Next thing we got to do is we have this adapter here, which is going to be the port for the Retro Gem. So it just fits in like that. And now we're going to go ahead and plug this part in. And you get a nice clean port, like so. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and it has 2 mounting screws, so I'm going to place those in and then use the lock nuts on the sides here just to get that tightened up. Okay, so the next thing we're going to start doing is just some trimming to the top of the shell over here. So we've got to cut off this amount of metal right here. This is where the HDMI port is going to go. So this is pretty simple. You just need to start with your flush cutter and make some initial cuts just to indicate where you're going to go. And then the rest you can just kind of bend. Okay. I'm probably just going to get rid of these fingers first. Okay. So yeah, it just takes a few minutes, but now we've got a nice opening right over here. All right, so I actually realized upon looking at the Slim board a little bit more that I actually do not have a version with a 56K modem. I saw the port and just saw, okay, there's the modem port, and then upon looking at it more carefully, I realized that was Ethernet, and this is not a version with a modem. So glad I figured that out. Now we're gonna just change up the install a little bit. So to do an installation without a 56K modem, you actually have to do a lot more trimming of the case. First thing you gotta do is just kind of push down on the back end of this 3D print with like a X-Acto knife like this, and then you can just kind of wiggle this back and forth. And that just comes right off and shortens the size of this 3D print. So it's just a little bit shorter than the version for the 56K modem. That's actually a really nice design that they have there. So yeah, that's all taken care of. The next thing we've got to do is a rather extensive amount of modding to the back of the shell. So the PixelFX guys, they provide a little jig here for the cutout that you need to make for the HDMI port. So you can see here, it fits right into the Toslink port and just kind of lines up like this. And then this opening right here is where I'm going to need to cut, and that's where the HDMI is going to live. So I'm going to go ahead and actually do that off camera because I have a workshop where I have all this stuff. It's not really easy to film that, but you know, I'm just going to basically be using a metal file and my X-Acto knife here just to kind of get this exactly the way I want. You can also use something like a Dremel, but I find that I have much better control if I go slow and I use those tools instead. So I'll be back in a minute and we should have an opening all set up right here. Okay, so I finished all of the filing work on the bottom half of the console. And yeah, I ended up just using really just a square flat file and having the jig in place right here, and then just very slowly removing material until you get a very nice snug fit where it just goes right where it's supposed to. That being said, it's still a little too tall. As you can see here, it's taller than this half of the shell, and that's okay. What I'm going to end up having to do is just remove some material from the top of the shell. So what you got to do now is just line up the top and bottom together like this. And then with an X-Acto knife, I'm going to just mark off and cut off the areas where this is going to fit, and then very slowly and carefully just whittle away at the top here until there's a nice snug fit. All right, so I made some small trims to the bottom of the shell, and as you can see, it fits pretty nicely. I mean, I'm just kind of holding it loose together right now, and I have the console partially reassembled, but you know, it gives you the idea, and it does fit exactly where it should, and there isn't any pressure being put on the Retro Gem. So the next thing I got to do is just mark the locations of where I need to place the screws so that I can mount this to the top of the RF shield. So it's basically going to sit like this, and it's like resting right inside of the notch that I created here on the bottom. So what I'm going to do is just come in with a permanent marker and just kind of mark you know, the locations of where I think I need to go, at least as best as I can here. Yeah, there we go. And yeah, that gives me the general idea of where I need to go. Yeah. So from here, I'll take a 2mm drill bit and drill some holes. And then we're going to use the supplied screws and nuts just to attach it to the top RF shield. Okay, so I drilled 2 pilot holes into the top RF shield, and you can see that it, you know, pretty much sits exactly where I want it to go. And I verified this with the console all put together and with everything in place. So now that I have those down, what I'm going to do is actually add a little bit of solder to the nuts and to the RF shield to lock those two together. The reason why is because if they're all together, it makes it much easier to take apart the console and basically disconnect the Retro Gem and then put it back together if I need to. This isn't mandatory, but it definitely makes things easier. So I'm just adding a little bit of heat and just bonding them together. Now I'm making a point of not bonding the screws themselves to the shield, just trying to get the nuts to be in place. Okay, so that's all set. So we just need to make one more change to the top shell, and it's just so that when the little Wi-Fi antenna gets plugged in, the cable has a place to go. So let's go ahead and do that real quick, and then we can actually move on to the fun stuff, which is the installation itself. Okay, so I have the Retro Gem mounted in position, and the last little bit of trimming I need to do is in this area right over here. So these pieces of plastic, they kind of get in the way of this cable here. This is for the Wi-Fi antenna, which is going to sit on top of the fan. But yeah, I do need to trim a small amount here, but it's something you got to be careful with, because on some models of the PS2 Slim, if you take away too much material here, you'll actually make a hole in the shell, and obviously we do not want to do that. So I'm just going to be careful and just trim down a little bit of this with my my craft knife here, and yeah, and then after that I think we should really be good to go and start with the soldering. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is solder on the controller and audio flex PCB. So this one goes right over here, over controller port 1, and we're going to solder it to these 2 points right here, and then bend it and solder it to 3 remaining points on the controller port. From there, it just comes down and around, and this is the audio IC that we're going to solder into. And it's just these 3 legs over here on this side right here. Okay, so now that the controller and audio flex has been installed correctly, we're going to do a few other things as we prepare to solder on the main flex PCB. So first thing is we've got to solder a wire over here onto the SPDIF port, and this will give us Dolby DTS and surround sound for the games that support it. And it's totally optional, it's not something you have to do, but it's a nice feature to add in case a person has that kind of sound setup for their gaming room. So just a simple single wire. This is 30 gauge Kynar wire that I'm using here, and this is going to loop over, and eventually it's going to be soldered onto the Retro Gem itself. So for now we're just going to let that go and leave it alone. So now we're on to the main flex PCB, and this is the most challenging and fun, or at least fun for me, part of the whole thing. So it's going to go right about here, more or less. And you can see that there's a bunch of vias here on the audio and controller flex. Those connect up to the pads over here on the main flex. We also need to solder in 3.3 volts and 5 volts. I believe, I have to go and look at the install docs just to be sure, but I believe the 5 volts is over here, and the 3.3 volts is on this side of the ceramic capacitor right here. So we need to connect up to that. So this one I think should be a lot easier to install than the one on the fat PS2, because with the fat PS2, you've got these components, especially this big crystal oscillator, that are kind of in the way. And with this one, you don't. You just have flat space. You just have a couple of filter caps that you've got to remove. So I need to remove these 3 over here, 2 on this side, and 1 on this side. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so all of those have been removed. You can see there's plenty of space here. Now everything's nice and flat. One thing I am going to do is grab a very thin piece of Kapton tape and cover up these pads here, because they come very close to the pads on the flex cable. So it's actually, if you're ever so slightly off, it's quite easy to solder these pads over to the flex cable, and then you're going to have a bad day. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just do that really quick, and then we're going to move to the higher power microscope and get started with soldering. Okay, so to get started, we are going to add a pretty significant amount of flux. You'll notice that all of the pads on the flex cable have been pre-tinned. So I did this just to make the initial connections a lot easier, because then I don't have to worry about adding solder to each pin. I already have at least something there to tack things in place and get the process started. And so you can see that I'm using a fine tip in this case. I think you can also use a chisel tip, but in this particular case, I was doing this just without any kind of magnification, just with the naked eye. So it was easier for me to kind of go point by point with the with this tip that you see right here, this kind of sharper, pointy tip. As you can see too, it's rather easy to bridge pins. So I did bridge them right there on the right-hand side. It's really not a big deal. You can just basically swipe at it with a clean tip, and that sometimes is enough to clear the bridge. Or if really necessary, you can come in with solder braid and you can clean it up that way, and that's totally fine. The important thing is just to take your time, not to try anything like drag soldering, because you could bend the pins or, you know, get them knocked into each other. It's also extremely helpful to have a binocular microscope, and normally that's how I do this kind of installation. But in this case, I was just looking at it without using any kind of magnification, because I had this camera here for your benefit. But yeah, normally, yeah, I don't do it this way, and I much rather have something like a binocular microscope that gives you just better visualization of what's going on. All right, so I'm going to continue doing this flex cable, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so now that the sides of the flex PCB are taken care of, we're going to take care of this larger side, which has most of the pads. So the same rules apply here. I'm going to use a pretty copious amount of flux, and I'm going to use that pointy tip to go pin by pin and get everything soldered into position. Oh, actually, sorry. Looks like I switched over to a chisel tip in this case, which is perfectly fine. And so one thing I didn't mention beforehand is that once everything is kind of locked into place, if you're doing what I do, which is using a mixture of leaded solder, you should really do a good job of making sure that that leaded solder mixes with the lead-free solder that was used on the PS2. So any modern consoles, basically anything from PS2 onwards, a lot of them use lead-free solder, and you got to make sure that leaded and lead-free solder are well mixed, because if you don't mix them, there's potential for cracks, and maybe over the coming months or years you might have cold solder joints, and nobody wants that. So yeah, that's the only other thing to mention over here. Okay, so now that all the hard work is done on the main flex, the next thing you've got to do is just go pin by pin and test for any potential shorts between either between pins or between pads. And you also want to make sure that there's continuity between the pin itself and its respective pad. So that's what you see me doing here. So I have it in continuity mode and I'm waiting to get a beep. So each leg is being touched by the red probe, and then each pad is being touched by the black probe. And as long as I get some kind of a beep, then I know that there's good connection. The next set of tests that I'll do is touching the adjacent pins to each other to see if there's any kind of a short. So that's extremely important because all of this stuff is really small and you might miss some little piece of solder that's accidentally shorting either the pads or the pins. If you didn't protect those vias on the PCB, it's also possible that you soldered one of the pads to them as well, and that will also create a short. So what you see here is I'm just going line by line and just making sure that nothing suspicious is going on. If you find something, then you've got to go back with your solder braid and try to get rid of that short. Absolute worst case, you may actually have to remove the flex cable. Let's just say it's one of the vias underneath. So really be diligent here and try to make sure that you don't have any problems going forward. All right, so now that all the hard stuff is done, we're gonna make a few final connections just to get everything wrapped up. So the first one that I'm doing right here is just connecting the main flex to the controller and audio flex. So this is really pretty simple. You just gotta line everything up with your hands and then go point by point and solder into place. You can see that what I'm doing right now with my chisel tip is just going and tacking down the extreme ends and making sure everything is soldered. And as soon as that's good, then you can go point by point and just get all of these pads soldered into place. The last thing to mention is the via that's right next to that ceramic capacitor. That's for 3.3 volts. So you have to solder that down onto the right-hand side of the capacitor, as you can see it here in the video. Okay, so we have to solder 2 more wires to complete all of the various connections. And so right here, what you see is soldering to this pad on this specific chip, and this is what's going to give us 5 volts. So you can see I'm just taking a small Kynar wire and just soldering it on to the leg of this chip. You can also see this in the PixelFX install documents if you want a more zoomed out image. And so then I'm just going to take the other side of this wire and connect it up to this pad here on the audio and controller flex. Okay, and the last wire we're going to be setting in is for reset. So we are going to solder one end of it to this pad here on the audio controller flex. And then the other end is going to go to this specific point on the motherboard. This is going to vary, again, depending on your motherboard revision. So definitely consult the documents to find exactly where the spot is on your PS2. Okay, so now that the soldering is like 99% complete, I just wanted to kind of go over all of the connections that I made using the microscope, because sometimes it's good to see it like this, like from far away. So we've got our main flex here, and as you guys saw, I tested continuity between the flex cable and the pins, and also looking at neighboring pins just to make sure there aren't any shorts, and there were not, so that is good. We've got our wire here for 5 volts, and so that's just going over to this IC that's giving us our 5 volts. Our 3 volts is coming in over here on the left-hand side of this filter cap. We've got our audio coming in, our controller coming in. This is the reset line, so as you can see, it's a really long line going from this square pad here all the way over to this pad right in the corner here. The location of this is going to vary depending on which version of the motherboard you have. So this is for like a GH, I think a 51 or 52 is what you can see here. And then finally, we've got this wire right here. This is for our Dolby Surround audio, which I'm going to connect up to the Retro Gem directly. So everything seems to be complete here. So now what I'm going to do is partially reassemble the console, and then we can get that last wire soldered in, connect up the main flex to the Gem, and do some initial testing in analog mode. Okay, so you can see that I have the console partially reassembled, and it's really not that difficult with the PS2 Slim, which is so much nicer than the PS1. I'm sorry, the fat PS2 rather. With the fat PS2, you have to go through all sorts of gymnastics just to get ready to test it, and so, you know, this is much better, and it's much easier if there's something wrong to take things apart and, you know, have a look at it. All right, so here's my wire for from the SPDIF to get the extra Dolby surround sound and all that. So what we're going to be doing is bringing it carefully over here, and we're just going to solder it to 1/2 of this F pad right here. It's not going to both sides, just the side that's closer to the Tryon chip. It's kind of tight, so not the easiest thing to solder, but there we go. Now it's in place and it's not touching anything else. All right, so the last thing I really need to do here is just plug this guy in like this so that the black side is facing up towards you. And just lock it down. Just double check that. Make sure it's really, no, it needed more. There we go, that's more like it. Okay. All right, so that's in place. And you can see I took the antenna for the Wi-Fi and just routed it right over here. It's a perfect spot for it. It just locks right down and it's out of the way. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and assemble the console completely now and just do a quick test of analog video first. And if that looks good, we're gonna move on to the HDMI test. Okay, so I actually didn't save the footage for doing the analog test, but I did test analog video first. Everything worked perfectly, and I actually ended up reassembling the shell. So just wanted to show it to you, and everything looks really good on this console. Yeah, the HDMI port just fits right in that little spot. It's a pretty nice, clean cutout there. And the only thing I kind of wish I had shown but didn't was that when you put the flex cable into the Retro Gem, you've got to make sure that it doesn't bump into the heatsink. So you have to kind of just fold it a little bit, I mean, like gently crease it so that it's out of the way and doesn't land directly on top of the heatsink, because if that happens, it'll kind of get crushed by the upper shell and you might damage your flex cable. So let's go ahead and just plug this thing in, and we'll go ahead and do a quick test. Okay, so everything is all set, and I've got a game inserted in the PS2 Slim. So let's go ahead and turn it on and see how it looks. Yeah, there we go. Oh, wow, it loaded up fast. Okay, that laser's in really good shape. That's awesome. Let me go ahead and do the button combination to bring up the menu. So to do that, you hold LR, the right D-pad, and circle, and your Retro Gem Shiny Edition menu will come up. And the first thing you want to do if you've done an installation is you go to System here, and you go to Debug Self-Test, and you should see hearts on all of these lines. So these hearts down at the bottom left, those are the RGB lines. You've got your clock, your horizontal and vertical sync. It needs to have hearts on all of them. If it doesn't, that means that either something is bridged next to its neighbor, or maybe it's bridged to ground or 5 volts or something like that, and you'll see low or high or X, or it might just be missing. So this is why it's really important to go through and test with the multimeter before you go ahead and reassemble the console and test, because you could be spending a lot of time for nothing. So yeah, but otherwise, oh wow, it's really loud. So yeah, everything is looking great. The image is super sharp and crisp. It's got really nice motion adaptive deinterlacing, so that makes a very, very big difference for the PS2. I would argue really that for the PS2, you know, you really should get the Shiny Edition so that you can get the best possible image. All right, I've had enough of that. Let me, let me just take that off. But yeah, it looks like it's working, and it's really gorgeous. And like I said before, I really love the form factor of the Slim. it makes it really easy to add to a gaming setup. I think the only downside is that it's not easy at all to use with hard drives, but even nowadays there's ways of doing that. It's just an extremely complex mod that you can do. But all right, that's it for this week's video. If you guys like this kind of content, then consider subscribing to the channel. I have videos out like this every week. And then of course, if you have a console you want repaired or modified, you can reach me directly at oneuprestorations.com. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.